My name is Sophie. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as a calm person. The dependable one. The woman who shows up on time, remembers birthdays, keeps the household running, and doesn't raise her voice. I'm a mother first, a professional second, and, if I'm being honest, a person who learned very early how to take up as little emotional space as possible. People tend to underestimate me. Not in a cruel way, more in a quiet, almost polite way. They assume I'm soft because I speak gently, that I'll adapt because I always have, that my patience means I don't notice things, or that I notice them and let them go. I've been called easygoing, low maintenance, and once, memorably, unshakable. What they didn't see was how much strength it took to stay still. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense, or explosive arguments, or a villain you can easily point to. It's about time, about erosion, about what happens when you stay married for the kids, long enough that you forget when the decision stopped being temporary and started being your identity. For 6 years, I told myself I was doing the right thing. I told myself stability mattered more than joy, that silence was better than conflict, that children don't need a happy mother as much as they need a present one. I built routines, I kept the peace, I absorbed disappointment and called it maturity. And then one afternoon, my son asked me a question so simple it felt almost accidental. That question broke what silence never could. In this video, I'm not going to dramatize what happened next. There's no revenge arc here, no screaming matches, no moment where everyone suddenly understands me and applauds. What there is clarity. Slow, deliberate, uncomfortable clarity. The kind that arrives not with fireworks, but with a quiet certainty that something inside you has reached its limit. I'll walk you through who I was in that marriage, how I became invisible without realizing it, and how silence, when chosen consciously, can become a form of power rather than surrender. This is a story about psychological reversal, not in others, but in myself. About choosing integrity over performance. About leaving without burning everything down. If you've ever stayed somewhere longer than you should have because leaving felt like it would hurt everyone else more than it hurt you, you might recognize parts of yourself here. So before we go any further, let me ask you gently. Have you ever noticed when your sadness became so quiet that other people stopped hearing it? To them, I was dependable background noise, not in a cruel way. More like furniture you trust will always be there. The chair by the door, the lamp that turns on without flickering. Useful, reliable, and rarely looked at directly. In my marriage, I was the steady one. The one who remembered school deadlines, dentist appointments, and which kid hated crusts on their sandwich. I was the emotional regulator of the household. If there was tension, I smoothed it. If there was silence, I filled it just enough to keep things functional. I learned how to anticipate moods the way sailors read weather. Small shifts in tone, pauses that meant don't push, sighs that meant back away. People praised me for it. You're so patient. You're amazing at holding everything together. I don't know how you do it. What they didn't say, but showed, was that they expected me to keep doing it, forever. My husband used to introduce me as the organized one. At first, it sounded like admiration. Over time, it became a way of handing responsibility back to me. If something went wrong, it was a surprise. If something went right, it was expected. I handled logistics. He handled presence, being there without carrying. I don't think he ever thought of himself as unkind, and that made it harder to name what was happening. There were no obvious villains, no sharp betrayals, just a slow redistribution of emotional labor until my inner world became irrelevant to the functioning of the family. To friends and extended family, I was the stable wife, the good mother, the one who understood how hard things were for him. I absorbed that role so thoroughly that people stopped asking how I was doing. Not because they didn't care, but because I never disrupted the story. At some point, I stopped correcting them. I told myself invisibility was a form of peace, that being low demand made the household calmer, that this was adulthood, choosing the long game over momentary feelings. I learned how to minimize my own reactions so efficiently that even I started to believe they weren't important. I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. I wasn't crying in the shower or fantasizing about escape. I was muted, like a song turned down so low it still plays, but no one notices when it ends. There were moments, Small ones, where I almost spoke up. When a decision was made without me, when my opinion was summarized incorrectly, when a joke landed at my expense, everyone laughed because it wasn't that bad. I would feel a brief internal tightening, then I'd release it. I didn't want to be difficult. I didn't want to make things heavy. And slowly people learned something about me. They learned I would adjust. If plans changed, I'd adapt. If expectations grew, I'd stretch. If something hurt, I'd carry it quietly. That's the thing about being consistently reasonable. You train others not to worry about your limits. Even my children saw me as the constant. The one who was always there, always available, always emotionally steady. I was proud of that. I wanted them to feel safe. I didn't realize that in modeling stability, I was also modeling self-erasure. I told myself, this is temporary. When the kids are older, when things settle down, when he's less stressed. But time doesn't wait for conditions to improve. It just keeps moving, and one day you realize you've been holding your breath for years. If you had asked me then whether I felt invisible, I would have said no. I would have said I felt needed, valued, trusted. It took much longer to understand the difference between being needed for what you provide and being seen for who you are. At that stage of my life, I was useful. I was functional. I was respected in an abstract way. But I was no longer perceived as someone with edges, with limits, with inner weather that mattered. And the most dangerous part, I helped build that version of myself, not out of weakness, out of love, out of responsibility, out of the belief that enduring quietly was a form of strength. I didn't yet know that strength can turn into a cage when no one remembers you're inside it. The first time it happened, I almost missed it. That's what makes small cuts so effective. They don't announce themselves as wounds. They arrive disguised as nothing. A comment was said too quickly, a decision made too casually, something that, on its own, doesn't justify a reaction. For me, it was a conversation at the kitchen counter. We were standing there in the early evening, the hour when dinner wasn't ready yet, but everyone was already hungry. The kids were in the living room, half watching something loud and animated. I had just finished explaining a plan I'd put together, nothing major, a schedule adjustment so I could take on a short consulting project again, a few hours a week, flexible, thought through. I remember being careful with my tone, calm, reasonable. I framed it as logistics, not desire. He didn't even look up from his phone. Yeah, that won't really work, he said. Not sharply, not unkindly, just conclusively. The kids need you around more right now. That was it. No follow-up question, no curiosity, no pause that suggested my explanation had actually landed. Just a gentle dismissal wrapped in practicality. I laughed it off. I even nodded. I remember saying something like, okay, we can revisit it later. I told myself he was tired, that timing was bad, that I could bring it up again another time. But something had already registered. It wasn't that he disagreed. Disagreement is normal. It was the assumption underneath it, that my role was fixed and my inner life was adjustable. That evening passed like every other. Dinner, homework, bedtime routines. On the surface, nothing had changed, but inside me, a tiny recalibration had occurred. A line had been crossed so subtly it didn't leave a mark, just a sensation. I noticed how easily my idea had been overruled, how natural it felt to him, how quickly I had accepted it. The next day, I replayed the moment while folding laundry. Not angrily, curiously. I asked myself why it bothered me when, objectively, it made sense. The kids did need stability. The household ran more smoothly when I was available. That's how rationalization works. It borrows the language of responsibility to silence discomfort. I didn't bring it up again. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to create friction over something small. I told myself it wasn't worth the emotional energy, that this was just how partnerships worked, give and take, ebb and flow. But here's what stayed with me. No one else noticed. Not him, not the kids, not my friends when I mentioned, lightly, that I'd postponed going back to work again. Everyone nodded. Everyone understood. Everyone affirmed how lucky my family was to have me. And in that collective approval, my quiet disappointment had nowhere to land. That was the first small cut. Not dramatic enough to bleed, not visible enough to justify concern, but sharp enough to make me more careful next time. More selective about what I shared, more inclined to pre-edit my desires before they ever reach my mouth. After that, I started to notice patterns. How often were decisions framed as already settled by the time I heard about them? How my emotional bandwidth was assumed to be infinite? How my flexibility was treated not as a gift, but as a given? Each instance was minor, each one is deniable, each one is easy to excuse. And that's the danger of being reasonable in unreasonable situations. You become the perfect container for things that shouldn't belong to you. I didn't feel angry yet. I felt educated, as if I had learned something important about the shape of my life without anyone spelling it out. I learned that my needs were negotiable, that my aspirations were optional, that my silence would be interpreted as consent. Most of all, I learned that if I didn't guard the edges of my inner world, no one else would do it for me. At the time, I still believed the solution was to communicate better, to choose a better moment, to explain myself more clearly next time. I didn't yet understand that clarity isn't always the problem. Sometimes the problem is that the system you're in has already decided who you are allowed to be. After the first small cut, nothing dramatic happened. That's important to say, because if something had happened, I might have responded differently. A clear insult, a raised voice, a betrayal you can point to and say, "There, that's when it broke." But this wasn't a break. It was a slow adjustment to what I considered normal. Disrespect, when it arrives quietly, rarely feels like disrespect. It feels like an inconvenience, like misalignment, like being slightly out of sync with the people around you. And when you're committed to harmony, you instinctively assume the problem is you. So I adapted. When my opinions were skimmed over in conversations, I told myself I hadn't explained them well enough. When plans changed without consulting me, I reasoned that someone had to be flexible, and I was good at that. When jokes were made about how Sophie will handle it, I smiled along, because technically, I would. I became very skilled at minimizing my own reactions. I learned which topics were worth bringing up, and which would only result in a polite shutdown. I learned to present my needs as suggestions and my desires as hypotheticals. I learned to say things like, "It's not a big deal," before anyone else could decide whether it was. And slowly, the world around me adjusted to the quieter version of myself. My husband started assuming my agreement before I gave it. Not maliciously, just efficiently. He'd say, "I told them we're good with that." And I'd nod, even when I wasn't. Not because I couldn't object, but because objecting now felt like creating unnecessary work. That's how normalization happens, not through force, but through convenience. Even my internal dialogue shifted. When something bothered me, I didn't ask, "Why did that happen?" I asked, "Why am I reacting this way?" I treated my discomfort like a personal flaw, something to manage privately rather than address collectively. I told myself I was being mature, that this was what a long-term partnership looked like, that passion fades but commitment remains, that children benefit from predictability more than emotional authenticity. And for a long time, those stories worked. I wasn't miserable. I was functional. I laughed, I hosted, I showed up. From the outside, our life looked calm, even enviable. No chaos, no drama, no public cracks. But inside, something subtle was happening. I stopped expecting to be considered, not in a resentful way, more like a pragmatic one. I began entering situations already prepared to adjust, already anticipating the compromise, already calculating how to absorb the impact with minimal disruption. It became second nature, almost elegant. That's the part no one talks about. The way self-silencing can feel like competence, like emotional intelligence, like being above petty needs. I remember a moment at a family gathering when someone asked what I wanted for my birthday. It was a casual question, thrown into conversation. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. Not because I didn't want anything, because I hadn't practiced wanting out loud in a long time. I laughed it off. "Oh, I'm easy," I said. "Whatever's fine." Everyone smiled. Problem solved. Later that night, I lay awake trying to name the feeling in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness in the traditional sense. It was more like distance from myself. That was when I first realized that disrespect doesn't always look like someone treating you badly. Sometimes it looks like everyone is treating you reasonably, while consistently ignoring the parts of you that don't serve them. And the most dangerous part? I was complicit. I rewarded the behavior by adapting to it, by being understanding, by making myself smaller in ways that were socially praised. I taught the people around me that I didn't require much, and they believed me. Silence became my default response. Not because I was afraid, but because I had convinced myself that speaking wouldn't change anything meaningful. That belief is powerful and corrosive. It doesn't explode your life, it erodes it, slowly, politely, until one day you realize you've been living inside the outline of someone else's expectations. At that point, I still thought endurance was the answer. That if I just stayed steady, things would eventually rebalance. That my quiet would be recognized as a strength. I didn't yet understand that systems rarely correct themselves without disruption. And I certainly didn't understand that the version of me everyone relied on was the same version that was disappearing. I don't remember anyone formally assigning me a role. There was no conversation, no agreement, no moment where someone said, "This is who you are now." It emerged the way weather does, gradually, predictably, until you stop expecting anything else. I was the reliable one, the emotional buffer, the person who could be counted on to absorb impact so others didn't have to. If something was uncomfortable, it passed through me first. If something needed doing, it found its way to me. And the strangest part, everyone thought this was fair, because I was good at it. I handled conflict by dissolving it. I handled disappointment by reframing it. I handled exhaustion by compartmentalizing it. From the outside, it looked like competence. From the inside, it felt like a disappearance. My husband came to see me not as a partner with a parallel inner life, but as a stabilizing force, a constant, someone whose presence ensured smooth functioning. He'd say things like, "You're just better at this stuff," or "You don't get as affected as other people." At first, I took that as a compliment. Then I realized it came with an expectation that I would continue to be unaffected. My emotional responses, when they did surface, were treated as anomalies. If I was quiet one evening, he'd ask what was wrong, not with curiosity, but with mild confusion, as if a dependable appliance had started making an unfamiliar sound. I learned quickly that stepping out of character made people uneasy. Friends leaned on me because I was good in a crisis. Family members called me when they needed perspective. I became the person who could be trusted to stay calm, to offer measured advice, and not make things about herself. And every time I fulfilled that role, it reinforced itself. I wasn't seen as someone who might need care. I was seen as someone who provided it. Even in my own home, my needs became logistical rather than emotional. If I was tired, it was because the schedule was full. If I was quiet, it was because the day had been long. No one considered that something deeper might be happening, because the role I played didn't include that dimension. I remember once saying very softly, "I don't feel like myself anymore." It landed like a vague statement. Concerning maybe, but not urgent. It didn't fit the narrative of who I was, so it was gently set aside. We moved on to practicalities, to solutions that addressed the surface, not the source. That was the moment I understood something important. I wasn't being misunderstood. I was being correctly understood. According to the version of myself I had consistently presented, roles don't require cruelty to be limiting. They just require consistency. The more reliable I was, the less room there was for complexity. The more I absorbed, the less anyone expected me to object. My calm became a contract I never signed, and still I stayed, because the role came with validation. People needed me, relied on me, praised me for my strength. And when you've built your identity around being essential to others, stepping out of that role feels like a form of betrayal. Not just to them, but to the self you've been performing for years. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. Those roles were necessary in families, that someone had to be the steady one, and I was capable of carrying it. What I didn't see yet was how asymmetrical the arrangement had become. I was allowed to be strong, but not vulnerable. Present, but not prioritized. Essential, but not consulted. And because there was no overt conflict, no raised voices or slammed doors, I had no language for the quiet imbalance I was living inside. I was doing everything right, and slowly and visibly it was costing me myself. The realization didn't arrive as anger, it arrived as awareness. A subtle but unmistakable understanding that the role I was playing was never designed to include my full humanity. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. There was no argument. No revelation delivered in a raised voice, no moment where someone finally crossed a line so obvious it demanded confrontation. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind that disappears into memory unless something anchors it. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my son, helping him with homework. He was 8 then, old enough to ask real questions, young enough to ask them without strategy. The house was quiet in that mid-afternoon way, sunlight slanting across the table, dust visible in the air if you looked closely. We were working through a reading assignment when he stopped, pencil hovering above the page. "Mum," he said, not looking up, "why do you always look sad?" The question wasn't accusatory, it wasn't even especially emotional. It was curious, observational, like he was asking why the sky looked different before it rained. I felt something inside me pause. I didn't answer right away. Not because I was trying to hide anything, but because I realized I had never prepared for that question. I had rehearsed explanations for adults, rationalizations, deflections, but not for a child who had simply noticed the truth. "I don't look sad," I said gently, instinctively. The reflex came faster than thought. He looked up then, really looked at me. "You do," he said. "Not like crying sad, just quiet sad." That phrase landed with surprising precision. Quite sad. The kind that doesn't interrupt schedules, the kind that still packs lunches and attends school events, the kind that hums beneath the surface, low enough that most people stop hearing it. I smiled because that's what I had trained myself to do. I told him I was just tired, that grown-ups get tired sometimes, that everything was okay. He nodded, accepted the answer, went back to his work. But something in me had already broken open, not because he had seen through me, but because I suddenly understood who had been watching all along. Children don't need explanations to perceive emotional truth. They live inside it. And in that moment, I realized that the emotional atmosphere I thought I was managing so well had been noticed by the person I was staying silent for. I wasn't protecting him from my sadness. I was teaching him to normalize it. That realization was unbearable. I sat there long after he'd finished his assignment, the house still quiet, the question echoing in my mind. Not accusatory, just present. "Why do you always look sad?" I thought about the 6 years I'd spent telling myself I was staying for the kids, the sacrifices, the silence, the careful maintenance of stability, and suddenly the logic collapsed under its own weight. Because my son wasn't asking why I was sad that day. He was asking why I always looked that way. That's when I understood that what I had normalized for myself had become the emotional baseline of our home. And no one had ever asked me about it, until the person who mattered most. I didn't confront my husband that night. I didn't announce a decision. I didn't even articulate the realization out loud. But something fundamental shifted. The question reframed everything. It stripped away my justifications. It bypassed my adult logic and landed directly in the truth I had been avoiding. That my silence was no longer neutral. It was instructional. I saw with sudden clarity that endurance wasn't invisible. It was being modeled, absorbed, learned. And for the first time, staying quiet felt less like strength and more like complicity. That night, after the house was asleep, I sat alone in the dark living room and let the truth surface without fixing it, without reframing it, without deciding what to do next. I didn't need a plan yet. I just needed to stop lying to myself. The shift wasn't outward. No one else noticed anything different the next day. I still made breakfast, still kept routines, still spoke calmly. But internally, the story I had been telling myself ended. I no longer believed I was staying for my children. I was staying because I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped. And once that realization settles in, you can't go back to the old narrative. You can only move forward, quietly, deliberately, and with your eyes open. After that afternoon, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing shifted. I didn't suddenly start speaking up. I didn't demand conversations or set ultimatums. I didn't withdraw emotionally in a way anyone could point to. But internally, something fundamental had altered. Before, my silence had been automatic, an instinctive response shaped by habit, responsibility, and the desire to keep things smooth. Now, it has become deliberate. I noticed the difference immediately. When a decision was made without consulting me, I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but instead of pushing it away, I observed it. I let it exist without neutralizing it. I didn't rush to explain it away or convert it into understanding. I simply took note. That was new. I started paying attention to patterns I had previously blurred over. Who spoke first in conversations? Whose discomfort was addressed immediately? Whose was deferred? I noticed how often my adaptability was used as a structural support rather than a mutual exchange. And I stopped correcting the imbalance for everyone else. Not in a punitive way, in a clarifying one. When my husband assumed my agreement, I didn't rush to reassure him. I didn't fill the silence with accommodation. I let the pause stretch just long enough for the assumption to be visible, even if it went unchallenged. Silence, when chosen, is different from silence imposed. It holds information. I stopped volunteering emotional labor automatically. If someone was upset, I didn't immediately step in to regulate. I listened. I waited. I let other people sit with their own discomfort a little longer than they were used to. At first, they interpreted this as fatigue or distraction. No one asked if something was wrong. They assumed I was still the same person, just temporarily quieter. That assumption worked in my favor, because while they mistook my silence for weakness, I was using it to observe with clarity I'd never allowed myself before. I started writing things down, not grievances, not accusations, just facts, dates, decisions, patterns of interaction. How often I deferred, how often my input was requested versus assumed, how often my emotional state was checked in on versus inferred. There was no drama in it. It felt almost clinical. And for the first time in years, I wasn't trying to manage the emotional environment. I was studying it. This shift didn't make me colder. It made me steadier. I realized how much energy I had been expending smoothing edges that weren't mine to smooth. How much space opened up when I stopped doing that work reflexively. My husband noticed something, but not what I expected. "You've been really calm lately," he said one evening. "Like, extra calm." I smiled. The comment wasn't wrong. It just misunderstood the cause. I wasn't calmer because I cared less. I was calmer because I had stopped negotiating with myself. Before, every moment of discomfort triggered an internal debate. Should I say something? Is this worth it? Am I overreacting? That mental friction was exhausting. Now I let moments be what they were. I didn't assign them immediate meaning. I collected them. Silence became a container rather than a void. I was no longer using it to disappear. I was using it to see. And the more I saw, the clearer something became. The dynamic I was living in depended on my participation to remain stable. The system worked because I worked it. That understanding wasn't empowering in a dramatic way. It was sobering. It meant that if anything were to change, it wouldn't be because someone suddenly understood me. It would be because I chose differently. Not loudly, not impulsively, but with intention. For now, that intention was simple. Don't interrupt the pattern. Document it. Let people show you who they think you are allowed to be when you stop performing. Silence, when strategic, has a way of revealing truths that confrontation often obscures. And I was finally ready to see them. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Because learning, when it's quiet, doesn't look like preparation. It looks like compliance, like passivity, like the same woman they'd always known, just a little less expressive. That misconception gave me space. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't mark a beginning. I simply redirected energy that had once gone into emotional maintenance into something else, something private. I started with information. I reviewed our finances, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. I familiarized myself with accounts I hadn't actively managed in years. I updated passwords. I requested statements. I didn't accuse or confront. I just made sure I understood the structure I was standing inside. It was astonishing how much I had delegated without realizing it. Not because I couldn't handle it, but because it had been easier to let someone else take care of it. That ease came at a cost, distance from my own agency, so I reclaimed it quietly. I refreshed my professional credentials, took online courses in the evenings, after the house was asleep. Nothing dramatic, just a steady accumulation of skill. I reconnected with former colleagues, not to ask for favors, but to re-establish context, to remember who I had been before my world narrowed. No one noticed because nothing I was doing disrupted the household. Dinner was still on the table, schedules still ran. I didn't announce late nights because they weren't dramatic enough to require explanation. I used the same calm efficiency I'd always used, just for myself. I also kept writing things down. Patterns became clearer over time. How often my labor was invisible, how frequently decisions defaulted away from me, how rarely anyone checked whether I was willing versus simply available. Seeing it on paper removed the emotional fog. It wasn't about blame, it was about reality. And reality, once documented, is hard to dismiss. I began to understand leverage, not as manipulation, but as awareness. Knowing where you stand, knowing what you contribute, knowing what would shift if you stepped back. They never noticed that I stopped cushioning consequences. If something was forgotten, I didn't rush to fix it behind the scenes. If a plan failed because I hadn't preemptively smoothed it, I let the failure land where it belonged. Not angrily, just neutrally. People adapt quickly when they realize something they relied on isn't automatic anymore. But because I didn't announce the change, they framed it as a circumstance rather than a choice. That was important. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was trying to understand what my absence would reveal. And it revealed a lot. My husband grew slightly more tense, not outwardly, but in small ways, more questions, more checking in on logistics. He hadn't realized how much he relied on my invisible management until it wasn't as seamless. Still, he didn't ask why. Because asking why would require acknowledging that something fundamental had shifted, and it was easier to assume things would return to normal on their own. They often do, if someone is waiting. I wasn't. I consulted a lawyer, not because I had decided to leave, but because I wanted to understand my position without emotion. Knowledge without urgency is a powerful thing. I learned my options, my rights, the timelines involved, the implications I had never allowed myself to consider. I didn't tell anyone, not even my closest friend. This wasn't secrecy born of fear. It was privacy born of clarity. I also paid attention to my children. I watched how they responded to emotional undercurrents, how they mirrored dynamics, how they learned what to expect from relationships by watching what I tolerated. That awareness was painful, but it was also clarifying. Every night I asked myself the same quiet question. If nothing changes, what am I teaching them? And every morning I continued preparing. No dramatic gestures, no rehearsed speeches, just a steady repositioning of myself from the background to the center of my own life. What they never noticed was that the woman they thought would always adjust was learning exactly how much she had been adjusting and what it would mean to stop. And by the time they felt the shift, it would already be irreversible. The private reveal didn't arrive with excitement. There was no rush of triumph, no sense of victory, just a quiet, grounding clarity, like finally seeing the shape of a room you've been living in the dark. It happened late one evening, after the house was asleep. I was sitting at the dining table with my notebook open, documents spread out in careful order. Financial summaries, notes from consultations, a timeline I'd been refining for weeks without consciously calling it that. I wasn't looking for an excuse to leave anymore. I was looking for the truth. And the truth, when it settled, was simpler and heavier than I expected. I didn't need permission. I didn't need validation. I didn't even need confrontation. I had leverage, not the dramatic kind people imagine. No secrets, no scandals, no hidden wrongdoing, just something far more destabilizing to the status quo: independence. I could support myself, not extravagantly, not recklessly, but sustainably. The numbers were clear, conservative, responsible. I had options that didn't require burning bridges or upending my children's lives overnight. I had rebuilt something quietly enough that no one had felt threatened, yet solid enough that it didn't depend on anyone else's approval. Seeing it in front of me was sobering. For years, I had told myself I stayed because leaving would cause too much damage, that the cost would be unbearable, that I was choosing the lesser harm. But now I could see what staying was actually costing me: my emotional presence, my modeling of self-respect, my sense of agency. The reveal wasn't about what I could do. It was about what I no longer had to tolerate. I realized how much of my endurance had been fueled by uncertainty. Fear disguised as responsibility. The belief that I had no viable alternative. Once that belief dissolved, the dynamic lost its grip. I didn't feel angry at my husband. That surprised me. I felt detached. Not cold, just no longer entangled in the need to be understood. Because understanding wasn't the missing piece. Choice was. I saw clearly that the marriage functioned as it did, because I had been absorbing the imbalance. And I understood, with equal clarity, that no amount of explaining would make someone value what they had learned to take for granted. The reveal was internal. I didn't announce it. I didn't hint at it. I didn't test the waters with what-if conversations. I simply allowed the knowledge to settle into my body. And with it came an unexpected calm. I slept better that night than I had in years. Not because I had decided anything, but because the internal debate had ended. The constant weighing of, can I afford this? And what would happen if? Had resolved into quiet certainty. I could leave. That didn't mean I would. Not yet. But it meant that staying was no longer something happening to me. It was a choice. And choices feel very different when you know you can revoke them. Over the next few weeks, I noticed how that knowledge changed me. I was less reactive, less invested in small negotiations, less inclined to prove my worth. When tension arose, I didn't rush to smooth it. I let it exist. Not because I was checking out, but because I no longer needed the outcome to validate me. That shift was subtle but profound. People can sense when you're no longer trapped, even if they don't know why. My husband became more attentive in small ways, not dramatically, just alert, as if something had changed in the air. He still didn't ask, because asking would require him to face a truth he wasn't prepared for, that the woman he'd assumed would always stay had options. And I wasn't interested in reassuring him anymore. The private reveal wasn't a turning point in the story that others would notice. It was a turning point in the story I told myself. I stopped asking, how do I make this work? And started asking, what am I willing to carry, and what am I done carrying? That question didn't demand immediate action, but it made one thing very clear. Whatever came next would be irreversible. Not because I was angry, but because I was finally awake. The decision point wasn't a single moment. It was a narrowing. Once you know what you know, your options don't disappear, but they rearrange themselves. Some paths close quietly, others become impossible to ignore. I gave myself time, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the decision to come from clarity, not exhaustion. I watched. I waited. I tested nothing outwardly, but internally, I ran through every possible future. I imagined staying, not the fantasy version where things suddenly improved, but the realistic one, where patterns softened slightly, perhaps, but never fundamentally shifted, where I continued to be valued for my stability more than my presence, where my children grew up seeing a mother who functioned well but slowly dimmed. I imagined leaving, not the dramatic rupture, but the long aftermath. Logistics, adjustments, difficult conversations, the temporary discomfort that comes with change. I pictured myself alone in a smaller space, quieter evenings. The weight of responsibility is carried differently, but consciously. And I paid close attention to my body's response to each scenario. The first filled me with resignation, a steady, low-grade heaviness. Not panic, something worse, acceptance without hope. The second filled me with fear. Also relief. That distinction mattered. Fear can be worked through. Resignation settles in. I didn't want to leave out of anger. I wanted to leave because staying required me to become someone I no longer recognized. The true decision point came the night my husband said casually, "You're really good at handling things. I don't know what I'd do without you." It was meant as appreciation, and maybe, years earlier, I would have received it that way. But this time, I heard the unspoken continuation, "So please keep handling everything." I realized then that no explanation I offered would reconfigure the dynamic. Not because he was incapable of change, but because he had no incentive to initiate it. The system worked too well for him as it was. And systems that benefit from your silence rarely dismantle themselves voluntarily. That night, I made the decision. Not emotionally, logistically. I chose the path that aligned with my values, even if it disrupted the comfort of others. I chose to leave. I didn't rush to announce it. I didn't draft speeches. I didn't rehearse justifications, because this decision didn't need to be defended. It needed to be executed with care. I set timelines. I coordinated resources. I prioritized my children's emotional stability over my need to be understood. I chose discretion over drama. This wasn't an escape. It was a transition. I also made a quieter decision that night, one that mattered just as much. I decided not to negotiate my clarity away. I wouldn't soften the truth to make it easier for others to digest. I wouldn't stay longer to prove I had tried hard enough. I wouldn't wait for permission that would never come. I understood something fundamental. People often ask for explanations, not to understand, but to delay change. I wasn't interested in delay. The decision point wasn't loud. It didn't involve tears or raised voices. It involved a pen, a calendar, and the steady acceptance that some chapters end not because they explode, but because they've been fully read. I slept deeply that night. Not because the path ahead was easy, but because it was clear. Once the decision was made, everything slowed down. Not externally, life continued at its usual pace. School runs, meals, conversations about schedules, weather, and minor inconveniences. But internally, I shifted into a different mode. Execution. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means not broadcasting. not seeking validation, not inviting opinions that complicate what you already know to be true. I began aligning the practical pieces carefully. I finalized financial separations in ways that were fair, documented, and transparent. I didn't drain accounts or make impulsive moves. I followed the advice. I prepared contingency plans. I made sure every step could withstand scrutiny, not because I expected hostility, but because clarity is easier to defend than emotion. I secured housing close enough to preserve my children's routines. Same schools, same neighborhoods they knew. Stability wasn't a talking point. It was a design principle. I coordinated with professionals quietly. Short meetings, focused questions, no unnecessary details. I wasn't seeking reassurance, I was confirming logistics. At home, I didn't change my behavior dramatically. That was intentional. People are most reactive to sudden shifts. Gradual consistency buys you time. My husband sensed something, but couldn't name it. I was still kind, still present, still efficient. But I had stopped over-explaining, stopped anticipating needs before they were voiced, stopped cushioning decisions that weren't mine to carry. The absence of my constant emotional calibration created a subtle unease. He asked once, "Is everything okay?" I answered honestly, but not fully. "Yes," I said. And it was true, I was okay. What I didn't say was that we were no longer aligned, because that conversation would come later when the structure was in place. Silence in this phase wasn't avoidance. It was sequencing. I protected my children from adult uncertainty as much as possible. Their lives remained predictable. Bedtimes, weekend routines, small rituals that anchored them. At night, after the house was quiet, I reviewed checklists. Not obsessively, methodically. What was done? What remained? What is needed follow-up? This wasn't fueled by adrenaline. It was fueled by resolve. I also noticed how differently people responded to me now. Without my constant emotional output, interactions became more transactional. Shorter, more direct, less dependent on my interpretive labor. And that confirmed something I'd suspected for a long time. Much of what I'd been providing wasn't being requested. It was being relied upon without awareness. I didn't resent that anymore. Resentment requires expectation. I was past that. There's a strange peace in acting without needing to be seen, in knowing what you're doing and why, without explaining it prematurely. I didn't need anyone to understand. I needed the path to be solid. The hardest part of moving in silence wasn't secrecy. It was resisting the urge to seek emotional confirmation. To say, "This is hard," and have someone validate it. To share the weight of knowing before others did. But I understood that premature sharing often invites premature interference, so I carried it alone. Not out of isolation, but out of respect for the process. I reminded myself daily, this is not about winning. This is about aligning my life with the truth I've already accepted. By the time the movement became visible, it wouldn't be a shock. It would be a fact. And facts, unlike feelings, don't require agreement. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They came in small disruptions, minor inconveniences, moments of confusion that didn't yet add up to a clear threat, but were impossible to ignore. At first it was logistical. Things I used to manage invisibly began to require discussion. School forms sat longer before being filled out. Appointments had to be double-checked. Schedules overlapped in ways they hadn't before. Nothing catastrophic happened, but the smoothness was gone. My husband grew more restless. Not angry, just unsettled. He asked more questions, not about me, but about processes, about where things were, about what the plan was. What are we doing about next month? Did we already decide on this? Can you remind me when? Each question was small, reasonable, but together they revealed something important. He was beginning to feel the absence of my anticipatory labor. Still, he didn't name it as absence. He framed it as disorganization, as stress, as things have been off lately. And because I no longer rushed to correct that framing, the discomfort stayed with him. That was new. For years, I had absorbed that discomfort before it reached him, translated it, smoothed it, resolved it. Now, I let it land where it belonged. Not with bitterness, with neutrality. The emotional consequences followed soon after. Conversations became more strained, not hostile, just less fluid. There were longer pauses, more miscommunications, moments where he looked at me as if expecting something I wasn't offering anymore. Reassurance. Emotional direction. Confirmation that everything would be okay. I wasn't withholding it to punish him. I simply wasn't providing what hadn't been requested consciously. That difference mattered. He began to sense loss without being able to articulate what he was losing. And that's a uniquely disorienting experience. When something essential disappears quietly. Friends noticed it too, though they couldn't name it. You seem different, one of them said lightly over coffee. Not bad, just distant. I smiled, let the comment pass. Distance isn't always withdrawal. Sometimes it's perspective. The most delicate consequences appeared with my children. Not in distress, but in awareness. They noticed I was calmer, less hurried, more present in certain moments, because I wasn't constantly managing everything else in my head. That calm wasn't sadness anymore. It was steadiness. And in subtle ways, they leaned into it. That confirmed something important. Stability doesn't come from sameness. It comes from clarity. At home, the atmosphere shifted. My husband became more attentive, not out of intimacy, but out of uncertainty. He checked in more often, asked how my day was, suggested things we should talk about sometime. These were gestures that, earlier, might have softened me, made me hopeful, encouraged me to explain myself more clearly, to give the process another chance. Now I received them without attachment, not because they were too late, but because they were reactive. And I understood that reactions are not the same as transformations. The consequences weren't dramatic enough to force immediate reckoning. But they were cumulative, like a structure losing load-bearing support, one beam at a time. I watched as he tried to compensate, doing more, asking more, hovering at the edges of conversations. But because the underlying dynamic hadn't been named yet, his efforts lacked direction. He didn't know what he was responding to, and I wasn't going to explain it to him. That phase taught me something important. People often don't recognize the value of what you provide until they have to live without it. And even then, they don't always understand what they're missing, only that something feels wrong. The consequences weren't punishment. They were information, and they were preparing the ground for what would come next. The moment he realized something was truly wrong didn't come with shouting. It came with urgency. Not the loud kind, the quiet, searching kind that appears when someone senses they're losing something they don't fully understand. It started with questions that were suddenly more personal. Have I done something? Are you unhappy? Why does it feel like you're somewhere else? They were asked carefully, almost tentatively, as if he were afraid the wrong tone might push me further away. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't rush to soothe that fear. Not because I wanted him to hurt, but because I understood that soothing him now would erase the very clarity that had taken me years to build. I answered honestly, but selectively. I'm thinking, I said. I'm paying attention. I'm not ignoring you. Each statement was true. Each one also revealed nothing he could immediately fix. That's when panic started to show, not as desperation, but as effort. He became more present at home, more helpful. He initiated conversations, suggested counseling, mentioned how hard the last few years had been for both of us. There was sincerity there, I don't deny that. But there was also timing. Everything he was offering now was a response to instability, not to understanding. And I could feel the difference. I listened, I acknowledged, I didn't dismiss his efforts. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I no longer wanted to be convinced. I wanted alignment. And alignment doesn't come from scrambling to repair a system when it starts to fail. It comes from noticing the cracks while they're forming and addressing them then. That window had passed. Not because I was unforgiving, but because I had already done the work of staying. I had already tried explaining, adjusting, minimizing, and enduring, quietly, repeatedly, for years. The irony was hard to miss. The moment I stopped carrying everything alone, it became visible that things were falling apart. And now, finally, it mattered. He asked me what I needed. It was a fair question, an important one. And I realized I didn't have an answer that could fit inside the marriage anymore. Not because my needs were extreme, but because they were no longer negotiable. I needed to live in a dynamic where my presence wasn't conditional on my usefulness, where my inner life didn't require justification, where I didn't have to become less to keep things stable. Those weren't things he could promise overnight. And I wasn't willing to wait for potential change at the cost of my certainty. That's when I understood something else. Repair requires two people noticing the problem at the same time. We hadn't. I had noticed years earlier. Quietly alone and without support. By the time he felt it, I had already reorganized my life around the truth. The gap between those timelines was unbridgeable. He wasn't wrong for wanting to fix it. He was just late. And lateness, in emotional terms, isn't about minutes or months. It's about arriving after someone has already left internally. I didn't say all of this out loud. Not yet, but I could see it in his eyes. The dawning realization that the ground had shifted beneath him without warning. And I could feel, with surprising calm, that there was no going back. Not because I was angry, but because I had already grieved the version of the marriage he was now trying to save. When the conversation finally happened, it was almost anticlimactic. No raised voices, no accusations, no list of grievances pulled from memory like evidence in a trial. Just two people sitting at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep. I had thought once that this moment would be charged with emotion, that everything I'd held back would demand release. But what I felt instead was calm, a deep, settled calm that didn't need to persuade. He started. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said. Not defensively, just honestly. I nodded. "I know," I replied. That was the first time I saw how unprepared he was for my steadiness. He had braced himself for anger, for tears, for something he could respond to. Clarity left him with nowhere to argue. He asked what had changed. I told him the truth, but not the long version. "I stopped lying to myself," I said, "about what this has been costing me." There was a long pause. He waited, as if expecting more. A catalogue of moments, a timeline, something he could address point by point. I didn't offer it. Because this wasn't about convincing him of my pain. It was about acknowledging it. He said he wished I'd said something sooner. I didn't disagree. But I also didn't accept the implication. "I did," I said quietly. "Just not loudly." That landed. I explained, not emotionally, but factually, that I had spent years adjusting, minimizing, and holding things together. That I had learned how to be quiet so effectively that even I almost forgot I was disappearing. He asked if things could change now. It was a fair question. I considered it carefully before answering. "Change isn't the problem," I said. "Timing is." I told him I wasn't leaving because of one moment, or one failure, or one argument. I was leaving because the version of myself required to stay no longer existed. He looked confused, hurt, not angry. "I'm trying now," he said. "I know. Oh, no," I replied. "And I believe you mean it." That was the hardest part for both of us. Acknowledging effort without allowing it to reset the clock. I told him I wasn't interested in assigning blame. I didn't see him as the villain of the story, that this wasn't about winning or being right. It was about alignment, about the fact that I had grown in a direction that couldn't be reversed without self-betrayal. He asked if there was anything he could do. I answered honestly. "No," I said. "Not because you're incapable, but because I'm done negotiating my existence." There were tears then, quiet ones, on both sides. But there was no chaos. We talked logistics, next steps, how to tell the kids, how to preserve what mattered most. The conversation ended the way it began, without heat. As he stood to leave the room, he said something that stayed with me. "I didn't know you were that unhappy." I met his eyes. "I know," I said. And in that moment, there was understanding. Not agreement, but recognition. Sometimes confrontation doesn't look like a battle. Sometimes it looks like two people finally acknowledging a truth that's been present for a long time, and accepting that naming it doesn't mean it can be undone. Who I am now isn't defined by what I left. That took time to understand. For a while, everything felt like a contrast. Silence versus noise, calm versus tension, space versus responsibility. I noticed how different my days felt, but I was careful not to build my identity in opposition to the past. I didn't want freedom to become another role I performed, so I moved slowly. My life became quieter in ways that mattered. Not empty, intentional. I learned what my energy felt like when it wasn't constantly allocated elsewhere. How my thoughts moved when they didn't have to anticipate or manage. I was still a mother first. That never changed. But I was a different kind of mother now. One who didn't confuse endurance with virtue. One who allowed her children to see emotional honesty without burdening them with responsibility. They adjusted faster than I expected. Children are remarkably attuned to congruence. They noticed that I smiled more easily, that my attention wasn't divided in the same way, that my presence felt fuller. Not because I was doing more, but because I was no longer disappearing. I didn't speak badly about their father. I didn't need to. I focused on modeling something else. Self-respect without bitterness. Professionally, I rebuilt with patience. I chose work that aligned with my values and my capacity, not my fear. I set boundaries early. I spoke clearly. I stopped apologizing for having limits. And people responded differently, not because the world had changed, but because I had. When you stop presenting yourself as endlessly adaptable, others adjust their expectations. Some relationships deepen, others fade. That's not a loss. That's alignment. Emotionally, I became more precise. I no longer diluted my feelings to make them easier to receive. I learned that clarity doesn't require intensity, it requires truth. I didn't become louder, I became more defined. The sadness my son had noticed didn't vanish overnight, but it transformed. It no longer lived quietly beneath the surface. It moved through me when it needed to, and then it left. That's the difference between suppressed emotion and processed emotion. One stays, the other teaches and then goes. I also learned something unexpected about strength. It isn't proven by how much you can carry. It's proven by knowing when to put something down. The version of me who stayed for 6 years wasn't weak. She was doing the best she could with the information and resources she had. I don't resent her. I thank her for enduring long enough for clarity to arrive. But I don't live as her anymore. Who I am now is someone who listens when discomfort speaks softly. Someone who doesn't wait for permission to matter. Someone who understands that silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen. I didn't leave to be happier. I left to be whole. And that wholeness is quieter than happiness, but far more stable. There's a reason I told this story slowly. Because the truth I arrived at didn't come in a moment of courage or a burst of anger. It came through accumulation, through years of quiet choices that, on their own, seemed harmless. That's the part I want to leave you with. Silence isn't always weakness. Endurance isn't always a virtue. And staying isn't always selfless. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is become too reasonable. When you absorb discomfort long enough, people stop noticing it exists. When you adapt endlessly, others assume you don't have limits. And when you stay quiet for the sake of peace, peace becomes dependent on your disappearance. I didn't leave because I stopped loving my family. I left because I realized love that requires self-erasure isn't sustainable, and it teaches the wrong lessons to the people watching, especially children. What my son saw that afternoon wasn't a dramatic breakdown. It was a pattern, a mother who functioned but didn't fully live. And that realization mattered more than any argument ever could. This story isn't an invitation to leave your life. It's an invitation to listen, to the version of yourself that's been speaking quietly for a long time. You don't need a villain to justify change. You don't need a breaking point to choose differently. And you don't need to wait until you're falling apart to admit something no longer fits. Sometimes the most honest thing you can say is, "This costs me more than I can afford." And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is act on that truth without trying to make it dramatic, palatable, or understandable to everyone else. If there's one moral here, it's this. Pay attention to what your silence is teaching the people who love you, because they're learning, whether you intend to teach or not. And before we end, I want to ask you something, not rhetorically, but genuinely. Have you ever stayed quiet so long that someone you loved noticed your sadness before you did? If you feel comfortable, share your experience in the comments. Your story might be the one someone else needs to hear, quietly, honestly, and right on time.
Cảm ơn bạn đã lắng nghe câu chuyện vừa rồi. Đừng quên like, share và bấm chuông để không bỏ lỡ